Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. The leaders of the Group of Seven stepped up pressure on China and Russia. Just after the G7 summit, China banned memory chips from a U.S.-based company in its infrastructure projects. Today, we look at how South Korea can manage complex relationships amid heightened great power competition.
대한민국은 자유인권 법치의 보편적 가치를 공유하는 나라들과 연대하여
in terms of talking to one another. I think you're going to see that begin to thaw very shortly.
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Zumwalt, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. Ambassador Zumwalt was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and was also Ambassador to the Republic of Senegal and the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. Also joining us, Mr. Charles King Mallory IV, Director of the Center for Global Risk and Security at the RAND Corporation. Mr. Mallory previously served as CEO of the Aspen Institute Germany and as a Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Zumwalt, G7 leaders united in demanding North Korea to refrain from provocations, including nuclear and missile tests. The liberal democratic countries are taking an unprecedented stand against authoritarian countries, including China and Russia. And North Korea is aligning closely with the two countries. Now, given the divide, will the leaders of the liberal democratic countries take more strong and resolute response to North Korea's future provocations?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to talk today. I agree that what the G7 leaders say and their support for nuclear nonproliferation remains very important. But I think it's also important to recognize the limited influence that the G7 countries may have on North Korea. Particularly with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, North Korea now has much more freedom to balance its Russian and Chinese patrons and to seek benefits from that. So that makes it harder for policies like economic sanctions to have much impact. So I think the main thing the G7 can do is to work to deter North Korea from provocations.
The G7 countries have long been expressing concerns over North Korea's provocations before, including the nuclear and the missile tests. But they didn't really seem to have the urgency, like Israel, for instance, in taking an action and calling out on North Korea's bad behavior. So you think the less urgency among the G7 countries will likely continue in the future? Or is it that they still have the urgency, but there's really not much they can do?
Well, within the G7, the United States and Japan have always, I think, had a sense of urgency about North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. But the difference may be that the European and the Canadian members are more concerned about North Korea's programs than they have been in the past. So I'm optimistic the G7 will continue to be involved in and concerned about this issue.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Mallory, the G7 leaders also emphasized the importance of non-proliferation and the NPT. And South Korea was invited to join the G7, and its foreign minister also mentioned the possibility of becoming a G8 country. Now, with the Hiroshima communique, will South Korea refrain from hinting at its own development of nuclear weapons?
Well, I mean, it's understandable. In nuclear deterrence theory, this is this concept of assurance. And during the Cold War, our allies in Europe constantly were looking for assurance about the US nuclear guarantee and not feeling very confident about it sometimes. South Korea, on at least 5 occasions since the Korean War, has considered starting its own nuclear weapons program. I think the most important development, yes, the statements of Biden and the G7 summit are important, but much more important is something that's happening behind the scenes, which is that the United States, Japan, and South Korea have started an equivalent in Asia of the Nuclear Planning Group. The Nuclear Planning Group was a group in NATO, or still is a group in NATO, where they actually talk about the tactical employment of nuclear weapons, should, God forbid, a war ever break out. And so I think that the fact that these conversations are now taking place at the sort of military level between South Korea, Japan, and the United States probably will give the government, at least, in South Korea more assurance that there's not that much need to start a nuclear weapons program.
And even though the South Korean government get more assurances from the nuclear consultative group, given that North Korea's weapons developments are heightening, wouldn't the public sentiment wanting nuclear weapons, that wouldn't go away?
No, I don't think it would. And a large part of what happened in Europe during the Cold War was a sort of public dialogue where we sort of played out how governments will react in the event of a Soviet provocation on the inner German border. And I expect that kind of a conversation is going to start developing in Asia, because that's the way you reassure the public that there are real plans and that there's no need to worry. They won't be abandoned. And remember, Japan is sitting upon several tons of plutonium. If South Korea were to start a nuclear weapons program, I don't think Japan would be slow to follow. And Japan has missiles capable of delivering a payload on an intercontinental distance. And I don't really think that's in South Korea's interest, to see a nuclear-armed Japan.
Mr. Mallory, the U.S. has civilian nuclear agreement with both South Korea and Japan, and the contents are different, where Japan, as you say, can reprocess the spent fuel rods, whereas South Korea cannot. Do you think South Korea should have the same level as Japan, have to free up South Korea's ability to reprocess the spent fuel rods and make more plutonium?
Actually, I think it should be the other way around. I think that Japan should have the same sort of restrictions as South Korea. It's never a good idea to have large amounts of enriched plutonium lying around that could be used to manufacture nuclear weapons.
And Ambassador Zumwalt, what Mr. Mallory just said, it's not a bad idea for Japan to get own nuclear weapons.
Well, first of all, I would respectfully disagree. I don't think there is public support in Japan for Japan obtaining nuclear weapons, because there's a very strong consciousness in Japan that they are the only country where civilians have been killed as a result of use of nuclear weapons. So there's a very, very strong anti-nuclear movement in Japan. But I think one area I agree with is the issue of Japan's plutonium stockpile, and how to safeguard that is certainly an issue. If you don't mind, if I could just add in, you mentioned South Korean public sentiment, being interested in South Korea obtaining nuclear weapons. I do think that probably the public is not aware of some of the consequences of that decision. If South Korea were to develop nuclear weapons, it would need a testing site, and probably not many people would want that testing site near where they live. It would be very expensive, so there would have to be a debate on what is not being spent in order to use that money. And finally, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty provides for civilian nuclear cooperation in exchange for South Korea agreeing not to develop nuclear weapons. So that civilian nuclear cooperation would end if South Korea launched a nuclear program. And I'm guessing that if the public were considering all of these factors, the polls might be very different than the ones that you're referring to.
As Mr. Mallory just said, Japan is sitting on plutonium. So while South Korean public is very out loud about wanting a nuclear weapon, Japan is quietly having all these capabilities to be able to obtain a weapon in a very short period of time. South Koreans being very loud about wanting a nuclear weapon, it's not a bad idea for Japan.
Well, first of all, the one thing to mention is the plutonium stockpile is under IAEA safeguards. There are inspections and accounting going on. So there are some protections. I mean, I agree that having this large stockpile is not in and of itself a good thing, but there are some safeguards in effect. But I do think that's why I would support more trilateral consultations, because while South Korea is looking for assurances from the United States, I think there are concerns about Japan's potential. And the reverse is also true. I think there's Japanese who are concerned about voices in South Korea saying they would like to obtain nuclear weapons. So I would favor more trilateral discussions of these issues to obtain greater clarity among the three powers.
South Korean government officials say that not yet. For now, Washington and Seoul work on the nuclear consultative group first and then add Japan in. What's the best for Washington? Is it better to have the trilateral discussions going on than the bilateral separately?
Well, bilateral discussions are better than no discussions, but I would ultimately like to see trilateral discussions. And the reason for that is one of the things we talk about with South Korea is, as my colleague mentioned, you go through various scenarios. If this happened, well, how would we respond? And our response would involve U.S. forces in Japan. And so therefore it'd be better, I think, for South Korea to obtain a complete picture about potential U.S. responses by including Japan and having a greater understanding of how the U.S. forces in Japan and Korea would work together to respond in various scenarios.
Another point that's worth bearing in mind when you are considering whether or not to acquire nuclear weapons, something that was brought home to me by discussions with the Iranians, is that when you're in the initial stages of a nuclear weapons program and you don't have a very large arsenal, you are in a moment of unique strategic vulnerability, because that is the time when it is the greatest payoff for an opponent to undertake a preemptive first strike against your arsenal. So in fact, launching a nuclear weapons program can actually increase your vulnerability, not decrease it. So when you have your first half dozen weapons and you're facing an opponent that has 30, 40, a couple of hundreds, they have what's called escalation dominance. And so they can strike you with many more weapons than you have. And as a consequence, it's in their interest to carry out a first strike and decapitate your capabilities while you still have a very small program. And so that's why in the initial stages of a nuclear weapons program, your country's strength can actually decrease, not increase, by virtue of having a nuclear weapons program.
And Mr. Mallory, German Chancellor Scholz visited South Korea soon after the G7 and agreed with President Yoon to promptly sign the General Security of Military Information Agreement. South Korea has GSOMIA with Japan and the US. How is it beneficial for South Korea to have it with Germany? And what sort of military information can the two share?
They'll be able to share classified information. I think that Japan and South Korea probably have a lot more information on North Korea than Germany does, although Germany has an embassy on the ground in Pyongyang. And presumably there's some intelligence collection that goes on from that embassy as well. I think it's really actually, my instinct is that it is, such an agreement is really beneficial to South Korea because it provides them with information, provides the Germans with information that will bring home to Germany what the stakes are for German industry if the conflict should break out in that part of the world.
If I could just add to that, when I was in the United States government, we did not have any on-the-ground presence in North Korea. And so we were, unlike almost every other country in the world, we had blind spots. And we very much relied on our colleagues in places like the United Kingdom and Germany to brief us on their personal experiences and what they saw on the ground in Pyongyang. And that human information was very, very valuable.
Ambassador Zumwalt, President Biden said that he expected a thaw in relations with China very shortly and that the U.S. is not seeking decoupling but de-risking. Now, South Korea has been joining in with U.S. and other Western countries push back against Chinese assertiveness. Now, if U.S. warms up its relations with China, wouldn't that put South Korea in an awkward position? And isn't this why some South Korean governments hedge between U.S. and China?
I think if United States-China relations improve, that will benefit South Korea, because you're right, South Korea is in an awkward position. They have a near neighbor with a very vibrant economic relationship on the one hand, and on the other hand, a security partnership and sort of like-minded agreement on what kind of world we want to see with the United States. So when the United States and China are having difficulties, that puts South Korea in an awkward position. So I think if U.S.-China relations improve, that will give South Korea more maneuvering room to manage both of its important relationships.
Now, I want to turn to China's first major move against the U.S. chip maker. Mr. Mallory, China's ban on the use of U.S.-based Micron technology could provide new opportunities for Samsung and SK Hynix. It is reported that the White House asked South Korea not to boost its sales to China if China restricts Micron's sales in China. What choice should South Korea make? Should it backfill or not?
It's not my role to give advice to the South Korean government, but I can give some of the considerations. And I think you have to distinguish here between different levels of technology. What we really care about, I think, is the latest nanotechnology lithography equipment, which is only available in a couple of countries, including the Netherlands, which I'll remind you is where A.Q. Khan got the technology to build the Pakistani bomb. So I think what we really care about is this latest cutting-edge technology, that it not go to China, and that not be used to develop technologies which will then be used against our alliance. When it comes to sort of workhorse chips that were developed 20 years ago, I don't think that's really a big issue. So I think a little differentiation is necessary here.
But it is reported that White House asked South Korea not to backfill the void made by Micron's, the ban that Micron is suffering.
So my question would be, did they ask that across the board for all products? Or did they especially emphasize the high technology, nanotechnology? And my guess is that's what they really care about.
But I do think there's a technology transfer is one important issue, but there's a second issue, which is how to deal with a China that uses tools of economic coercion. And that's what China's doing here, is they're trying to punish a U.S. company because they're unhappy with the United States policy. South Korea has been the victim of similar policies with the THAAD deployment, for example. Norway, Australia, Canada, Japan, many other countries have done similar. So I think what's really important here, the bigger picture is, it's very important for the United States, South Korea, and others to work together and develop policies for how do we collectively deal with Chinese economic coercion when it's directed against one country. What China would like to see is a lack of cohesion, that no one is supportive of the country that's being punished. But I think it's in South Korea and American interest to work together and figure out how do we raise the cost to China so that it no longer uses this kind of economic coercion. So in addition to the semiconductors and the specific issue, I think for South Korea and for the government, there's a larger issue of how do we as a country deal with a China that's willing to use tools of economic coercion against South Korea or against its friends and allies.
So you emphasize working together among U.S., South Korea, and Japan. And recently, President Yoon pledged to work together with the United States on economic security and supply chain resilience. And when asked about the White House's ask to South Korea about not to backfill, South Korean Trade Minister An Duk-kun says that it's up to the companies and it is not government's job to give directions. Now, how would that be taken in Washington?
I'm not aware of the specifics of what the U.S. government asked, but there's two issues. One is how should the government respond, and two, how should the companies respond? And those two South Korean companies also have major interests in the United States, and so they, I'm sure, as companies, will want to be considering what kind of impact does this decision, whether or not we sell more to China, what impact does that have on our U.S. relationships? And so that's something that companies have to figure out. But I think for the Korean government, the larger issue is this issue of Chinese use of economic coercion. And as a government, how do we wish to work with others? Just a few years ago, it was South Korea that was the victim of Chinese economic coercion. And to be honest, at the time, I felt the United States was not sufficiently active in supporting our ally when it was facing these kinds of challenges. So I'm hopeful that we can work together and minimize the impact of future, or maybe constrain China from future actions to use tools of economic coercion.
What is your response to the idea that get a firm cooperation promise from the government, yet give room for the companies to work? Would that be efficient?
I think the way the U.S. government describes its policy of de-risking is a small garden and a tall fence. And what they mean by that, and this is what you were getting at, we're not going to be imposing trade restrictions on a broad array of products. Let's look at the ones that are the most critical to China's development of its military capabilities. And let's focus on those areas, but then have a high fence that we actually can implement whatever restrictions we try and put in place. So that's, I think, something that the United States cannot do that alone. It needs to work with its allies who have a lot of technology, like South Korea. So that's really requires a more multilateral solution.
Mr. Mallory, the U.S. gave South Korean companies 1-year waiver on the shipment of advanced chip-making equipment to China. Now, before South Korean companies make the decision to whether to backfill or not, shouldn't they be aware that United States government have leverage, have export control tools in hand before they make their decision?
That's certainly a consideration. I think from a point of view of Korean national interests, the broader consideration is that 25% of South Korean exports go to China. And so South Korea has a large risk exposure. It's in Korean companies' own self-interest to try and diversify away from that risk in terms of, because if it comes to a conflict, that would be a major hit to the South Korean economy. And when it comes to coercion, we have actually done some preliminary work at RAND on this in terms of how to implement the G7 anti-coercion mechanism. And we looked at what the products are that we could ban the export to China of, with the ones that China's most dependent upon. And then we also looked at, if China chose to counter-retaliate, which of our allies would be most exposed and vulnerable. And the most exposed and vulnerable allies are Australia and South Korea. In the Australian case, it's iron ore and telecommunications. In South Korea's case, it's semiconductors and other electronic equipment. So that's also worth bearing in mind if you're a company executive, de-risking your overall exposure to China and understanding that at some point you're going to probably be looking to your allies for support if there is a conflict with China. We're talking about $75 billion in South Korean semiconductor exports to China. That's about just under 0.75% of GDP, not much, but it could wipe out an industry. And to combine between the iron ore, the communications equipment, the semiconductors, we're looking at about $195 billion of trade. So any such mechanism probably is going to need to have about $200 billion standing by to compensate victims. So it's very much in the national interests of both the government of South Korea and the industry of South Korea to hang together with their allies on this, because they would be beneficiaries of such a process.
To hang together with the allies, Ambassador Zumwalt, U.S. Seeks ally support in restricting high technology exports into China. What can the U.S. and South Korea, Japan do together to respond to Chinese retaliation?
I think it'll take more than just the United States, Japan, and Korea, but also our European friends, Australia, Canada. There's a broad array of countries. But this is something that really requires a lot of consultation and coordination among our friends. And while trade is one way China has retaliated, they've also retaliated, for example, by arresting people. China arrested 2 Canadian businessmen in retaliation for an action that Canada took when the United States requested to extradite a Chinese national that had entered Vancouver. So while trade is one area, there are many other ways China has chosen. Cutting off tourism. Korea has faced that, as have Australia and other countries as well. So there's a broad array of tools that China has to exert pressure on its people where it's unhappy. And so we really need to have a broad discussion in order to figure out how do we work together to try and help either through compensation or to impose more costs on China so that it is deterred from using these tools.
And China's quite vulnerable. That doesn't often come out in the discussion. All it takes is cooperation between 8 countries to cut Chinese imports by 20%. And one of those 8 countries is South Korea.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up our discussion here. Mr. Mallory, Ambassador Zumwalt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the 2 Koreas and the region right here from Washington.